Let us now bring it all together. So, first, what did we say about the risky assets? We said that there is a combination of these risky assets, different combinations that we can get for every level of return that offers the lowest risk, right? And one of them is a portfolio that is called the minimum variance portfolio, global minimum variance portfolio, because that is a combination of the risky assets which is offering the lowest risk as opposed to any other combination. And then above that, so all the way above that is what is the efficient frontier, which means all these portfolios along this line are efficient, but they're not all the same. See, you have to understand the slope of this line is curving. So, for every additional unit of risk, how much return am I getting? As you will see that the amount of risk is more and more and more, and the return additional is becoming smaller and smaller. So somewhere along this line is the best portfolio, and that is where the curve, the slope of this line is at a 45-degree angle, and then it just starts dropping, right? And that is what we call the optimal portfolio, or we also call it the market portfolio. Now, more on that later, right? But if you now take a risk-free asset, because all these assets that we have taken, all of these are all risky assets. They are all risky assets, and we tried to make different combinations of these risky assets, and we got to the optimal portfolios, the most efficient portfolios, but one of them is the best one, and it's not the global minimum variance portfolio, right? It's not this one. This one has the lowest risk, but it is still possible to increase risk and increase return, which is going to then start declining. But once it starts declining, we will stop. So we have to find that optimal portfolio, and the way we find it is that we take a risk-free rate, right, which is the return you can make without taking any risk, right? You can take zero standard deviation, which is your risk-free rate, and then you try and connect your risk-free rate to the efficient frontier as a tangent, right? And where the place where it sort of crosses, where it's tangent to the efficient frontier, that is where your optimal portfolio lies. And then you try and see, okay, where on this line, where on this entire line that I have now got, the capital market line, where do my investors in different curves sort of touch it, right? So different investors have different indifference curves. So depending on how sort of a risk averse person they are, how much risk seeking they are, or do they have a high risk aversion or low risk aversion, then you can choose the optimal portfolio for them. So this is basically what we're going to discuss. Now again, the efficient frontier can have multiple different allocation lines. So let's say somebody wants to take the risk-free asset and combine with the global minimum variance portfolio. That will create a different allocation line. But if you combine it with the market portfolio, right, that is going to give you the best possible capital allocation line. Because look at the slope of this line. I mean, for every increase of risk, the return is increasing nicely, right? So that's the point. We want a 45-degree angle. We don't want less than 45. Otherwise, I mean, more than 45 would be nice, but the portfolios are not available. I mean, we're talking about the real world scenario here based on whatever risky assets are available, right? But I mean, that utopian world doesn't exist. So that's why we have to take the real world and then see what is the ideal sort of slope we can get for the capital allocation line, that we can allocate capital along that line, increasing our risk and increasing our return. And then depending on the investors' indifference curve, what level of risk they are comfortable with, then we can combine that with this and then see, okay, what would be the optimal portfolio for that investor. But before we move on to that and bring it all together in terms of the risky assets, the risk-free asset, and the indifference curve, let's hold on to the indifference curve for now and just rediscuss the combination of risky assets and a risk-free asset. You know, I cannot explain to you, I cannot overemphasize the importance of this. It really makes a huge difference when you add a risk-free asset to risky assets, right? It just makes this whole situation much richer, right? And then you could be along this capital allocation, right? I mean, you don't have to put all your money in a risky asset, but you don't have to put your money in a risk-free asset. You can be along this line, and that is the beauty of this entire discussion. And of course, then you bring in the psychographics, the psychology of the investor, and say, okay, so this is my optimal capital allocation line, right? Which is obviously touching the market portfolio, the optimal portfolio. And depending on where their indifference curve meets the capital allocation line, that is their optimal portfolio, which in this case looks to be portfolio C. And this is based on the market. It's what is the most available, practically possible capital allocation that can be done. So you're bringing the wish list plus the reality and trying to find that sweet spot. Now, just like I was telling you from the very beginning, of course, I keep saying this is based on reality, but I told you that this is having two major assumptions, that it is assuming normal distribution of financial returns and market efficiency, which are actually decent assumptions to have. But they're not 100% true. Market is not 100% efficient. The financial returns are not 100% perfectly having normal distribution, right? But they are close. Market is close to being very, very efficient, and the financial returns are very close to being normally distributed. So this is pretty good. This is as good as it gets, right? Of course, there's room for improvement, and that's where you come in. But for the time being, this is the latest theory we have on the subject. So let's summarize this. Of course, risk and return trade-off is there, and you've got your high risk giving you high returns, small cap stocks being on top of the list, and then of course coming down to larger, more mature companies, so lower risk, lower return, and then bonds, corporate bonds lower, government bonds even lower, and short-term government treasury bills with lower maturity, lower return, and lower risk, right? Because the maturity risk is lower compared to the longer treasury bonds. In terms of investor utilities, we talked about this, right? What is risk aversion, how it plays out, and why they prefer a asset with lower risk. We talked about combining the whole capital allocation discussion and your optimal portfolio with the indifference curve. So very, very interesting discussion there. We looked at covariance divided by your two standard deviations, giving you correlation. Nothing new for you over here. You've discussed this before as well, right? And again, of course, nothing new for you over here, but I just have to emphasize that this is an important formula. You need to know this. And of course, the power of diversification, that the risk of the portfolio decreases even though you're adding a risky asset, right? Because the correlation is low. And yes, so these risky assets can be put together in different combinations where actually the risk does reduce and the return does increase. And from Z onwards, which is the global minimum variance portfolio onwards, you get your efficient frontier. And somewhere along this efficient frontier is your global optimal portfolio, or we also call this the market portfolio, right? And that combined with your risk-free asset then gives you the capital allocation line. Now in the next learning module, we're going to talk about how here we have 100% money in the risk-free asset. Here we have 100% money in the market portfolio, right? In the market portfolio. But then what's happening above this? So that is we're borrowing money. So this part is called the borrowing portfolio, and we'll talk about that in the next learning module. But what's basically happening over here is that if you put all your money in the market portfolio, but you still want more risk and more return, then what you could do is you could borrow money and invest it in the market, right? And that is something we will talk about in the next portfolio, depending if somebody really has that type of risk appetite, right? But let's look at this person who doesn't even have enough risk appetite to go for 100% in the market portfolio. So they are probably putting like maybe 80% in the market and the rest is in risk-free asset. They are not at that 100% point. They're a little bit before it because they are a little less risk-taking, or their risk aversion is higher than somebody who would want to put all their money in the market.